third point out of four, that formality and informality, order and disorder are key ways in which we think about these borderlands. So borderland governance and how it's ordered and navigating is well understood by the communities in these areas, but it may look disordered to outsiders or policymakers. And this is something in terms of the work, the research and the advocacy is key to kind of how we think about these spaces. And then lastly, unintended consequences of working in the borderlands are particularly important to think through. One of those that we know about is increasing formality impacts vulnerable and marginalized groups in an outsized way, as does increased securitization. So these are important unintended consequences that if you don't center the periphery, another favorite phrase, if you don't center the periphery in decision-making and thinking, policy thinking, there are often these unintended consequences. I want to hand over now to our panelists, and starting with Tasnia. Tasnia, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, for giving me the platform. And like you've said, I'm Khandaker Prova. I work as the climate research lead for the Center for Peace and Justice at BRAC University based in Bangladesh. And today, the findings or the data that I'm going to be talking about is collected in partnership with the Asia Foundation as part of the XCEPT program. So today, I'm going to be discussing the southwest borderlands between Bangladesh and India. So for a bit more context, Bangladesh and India share the 5th longest land border in the world. And despite being allies, these borders have been subject to bouts of violence, particularly from the side of the Indian security border forces, who have, been recorded killing primarily Bangladeshis, but also Indians who cross the border. And against that backdrop, we've chosen Southwest in particular because it's unique in two ways. One, it houses the largest land port that Bangladesh and India share. So this is a point of great, bilateral economic relationship. India has fed a lot of money to, Bangladesh to improve the infrastructure in the area. So this area is understood to be relatively low on violence, but sustains a system of negative peace that we see, and only very detailed research can sort of speak to the dynamics that emerge in these areas. And the second characteristics is that the Southwest in particular is recognized globally as one of the more climate vulnerable regions in the world. So particularly, one of the research questions that we've asked in this project is how do these dynamics interact with each other? One on the negative piece, and then relationships with border stakeholders, and also this being a climate affected borderland. How does that work? Next slide, please. So I'm going to start talking about how the things that we found on the field in terms of the cohesion that we've seen among community members. So among positive dynamics, I've written here, it's community members are the first responders. And even though this is a positive dynamic, which is celebrated by community members, where they talk about social cohesion and think that their neighbor is someone that they can depend on, it is also a symptom of the absence of structural support that is particular even after a climate disruption. I had a community researcher who talked about a story where a woman from his neighborhood took her personal blanket, put it atop an embankment, and then she proceeded to sit on the embankment to enforce it. This is the sort of vulnerability that affects the lives of people in the Southwest borderlands, and particularly the coastal regions. Again, for a bit of greater context, in the last 10 years, these areas have seen climate disruptions every year, so in the form of floods or cyclone every year. So every year, these communities have had to be forced to rebuild themselves over and over again. And so that creates a sort of communal cohesion, cohesive system where they are in the practice of relying on each other. And we've also seen community-based fundraising, where the wealthier families tend to distribute that resilience in the form of donations or extending their houses as an alternative to cyclone shelters that a lot of women don't feel safe to go to. Or for a lack of space, a lot of elderly, a lot of men aren't being able to, find space in these shelters. And the picture on the slide is of 3 young girls in Gabura, a particular coastal borderscape that we visited. And as you can see, the young girl is taking, water with her, because this is, again, a place where salinity intrusion has taken, a great impact and has affected the community vastly. And so even when they're trying to find these basic needs, water, there's a reliance on community members that we see. So because of the climate effects, what we've also seen is that there's increased competition over jobs like farming and fishing. Farmland is now being used for shrimp farming, which affects, local vegetation deeply. And there's competition over becoming aid beneficiaries. So as climate finance has sort of come into this area, a lot of INGOs and NGOs have their presence in the area, and then there's that competition over who gets to become the NGO volunteer. And we've also seen with an increasing number of climate disruptions, there are more feuds over things like land and livestock, especially because they're threatened every year. And so people feel a certain amount of anger if they're challenged in these aspects. And particularly for minorities, we've seen that issues of land grabbing they've been the common victim to these dynamics. Next slide, please. So moving on from communal cohesion within communities, we've sort of looked at how the community negotiates with stakeholders in these areas. And because of this being a borderland and also a climate affected area, community members are sort of pushed to negotiate with multiple stakeholders, and not all of them speak to each other. So for example, we've seen that climate change has affected fishing communities very, very deeply, but we have the forest department sort of issuing bans on fishers to go into Sundarban waters for about 60, 90 days. But what they don't realize is that their neighbor India has not imposed the same ban. So Bangladeshi fishers see that Indian fishers are sort of infiltrating on their fishing grounds when they're forced by the government to not go. And so that increases a lot of mistrust and tension with the stakeholders. They feel that they're not being understood. And especially when these stakeholders don't understand that this is a borderland and you have to respond in that way, you have to take the border into account. There's a lot of mistrust that goes in the works. And then we've also seen that elected officials tend to employ a system that benefits them when it comes to distributing aid or assistance or partnership. It is always those who have a good bond with them that are preferred. And that creates that sort of system of I can't trust my own leader. And again, that naturally means that a lot of community people are preferring community-based emerging leaders as opposed to elected authorities, and they tend to listen to them as to whether to go to the shelter or not. And then you have something that we've recognized as the primary driver of violence in these areas, which is the structural violence that these borderscapes are victims to. When structural violence sort of negotiates with climate change, we see the impacts being vastly exacerbated in these areas. So for example, they don't have access to proper health, proper schooling, and they have to negotiate with these dynamics while being a borderland and a climate affected area. And in particular, Bangladesh and India has shared, a long history of language, culture, and mobility. And because of the border, cross-border resource management, in many ways has been criminalized and has been turned into smuggling. And we've seen that smugglers in particular are privy to becoming, victims to indiscriminate killing, even when they're not armed by BSF. So these are some dynamics that these borderland, community members have to negotiate with. Next slide, please. So now I've spoken about, the communal cohesion that we found through our study, with obviously both within the community and with stakeholders. And now I'm going to be talking about how, as a research methodology, we prioritize communal cohesion. And we do so by using an iteration of participatory research. Our center, the Center for Peace and Justice, has done so, for many, many years, but it was in a different context in the Bangladesh-Myanmar borderlands with Rohingya refugees. And so replicating that methodology in obviously an area where, it's outside of a refugee camp environment, brought us to interesting questions and equally interesting answers. So what we've seen worked, for us at least, is pairing community researchers. And we did so by choosing one community researcher who's a young member from the exact location that we're studying, and then pairing that person with a local research enthusiast who goes to school or university in the area. So they both come with experience of living in these borderlands, but one obviously with more deeper connections and the other with more of a research interest. And we're really amazed by the ability of these two, uniquely capable people to come together and sort of complement each other. And lastly, this particular research method, it goes beyond enumeration. It's not just about transcriptions. We do something that is called pod analysis, where community researchers in groups analyze data and sort of reflect back and forth. We have chat hours where CPJ staff sit with the community researchers to talk about their experience in the field. And again, more reflection and feedback loops of asking, are we asking the right questions? Are we analyzing this correctly? Is this truly how you see the borderland? So I'd just like to end my presentation by saying how trust is a big factor in not just how we ask questions or find answers, but in also how we build those questions in the first place. On that note, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tasnia. And I think one thing I picked up on really strongly, and great if we can have various questions people have either in the chat or at the discussion later, is you talked about the cost, what I kind of think about as the costs of resilience. So all these annual climate shocks that people are having to endure, people are very resilient, they come up with all these coping mechanisms, but there is obviously a great cost to that. And I wonder also if that undermines or strengthens social cohesion. So look forward to the discussion. Ahmed, over to you.
And thank you, Hannah, and thank you to my colleague Tasnia, and thanks to the audience who have made time to join us online. So basically, I resonate with much of the points that Tasnia has made in the presentation, because for the past 4 years, I've been working on community humanitarianism during crisis, especially how Somalis respond to crisis, including the transnational support from the diaspora Somalis to the affected communities, and how the borderland communities host each other just so that they can be able to cope with the crisis. So thanks, Tasnia, for bringing to us insights from the Bangladesh borderlands. So now I would like that we turn to a different borderland, all the way to the Horn of Africa. I'm going to share some few insights from the Horn of Africa. And when I say the Horn of Africa, I'm referring to the borderlands between Somalia, Kenya, and Ethiopia, which are kind of Somali-dominated borderlands. So basically, and I'm going to focus a different theme than the climate change and how people cope with the climate change and now activating and using their cross-border connections. So basically, I will look at how the borderland communities also activate the same social connections to do business or to do trade and transactions using the social connections. So basically, just to give you an idea about those, maybe those of you who might not be familiar with the Horn of Africa borderlands, in the Horn of Africa borderlands, there are no formal official bilateral ties between the different national states. Due to some very complicated, very complex history of the borderlands and the formation or the making of the borderlands. Dating back to the colonial days in the 1950s and 1960s and even beyond. So basically, because of that, there are no formal, the formal institutions are either absent or very weak or unreliable, sometimes inefficient to facilitate cross-border economic activities. And because of that, sometimes the local, borderland communities perceive the formal institutions as a burden, as a destabilizing factor, and as institutions that are undermining their livelihoods, their economic livelihoods. So basically, because of that, the local community, the borderland communities activate, and I'm emphasizing the word activate, their borderland, their social connections, including trust. So that's one thing. And the reason why they activate, the reason why they, so I just want to make one overall argument, and then in the next few minutes, I'm going to advance that argument. So the overall argument is that the borderlands have not realized their economic potential due to low trust between states, and would have collapsed if not for the trust between the community, right? So now the question is, why am I making this argument? Why am I boasting this argument? It's simply because, as I said, the borderlands in the Horn of Africa have a very complicated history, and including the colonial, the history of the formation or the making of the borderlands, and interstate or intra-state conflicts that really made the borderlands kind of a source of instability, both economic instability and political instability. So the other thing is, like, it's not only the states that do not trust each other, but even within a state, the national and the subnational elites have also trust issues when it comes to the borderlands, because quite often the subnational elites are from the borderlands and the national elites are from the center. So there's always that tension that also manifests itself in the form of trust and between the national elite from the center and the subnational elite from the peripheries. So, for example, the national elite in Kenya, in Somalia, in Ethiopia, they perceive the borderlands as frontiers of instability, whether it's political instability or economic instability. But the subnational elite, they see that the borderlands are very important for both their political survival and at the same time for the well-being of their citizens. Then, as I said, most of the time, the formal institutions, formal banks, especially formal banks like custom authorities, are absent from the borderland areas. But when they are present, they become inefficient, very weak, and because of that, people try to not use those institutions, and then they just activate other more efficient institutions, which are the informal. Next slide. So now, taking into consideration those borderland realities, now the question is, then how do the people from the borderlands navigate these realities? So the trust is just one institution, one informal institution that does, the people from the borderlands activate to live with the realities of the borderlands. And trust, as we know, and we talk about in economic sociology, is an institution that constrains behavior, whether it's behavior of poor coordination, whether it's a behavior of maybe it reinforces the contracts and the social oral agreements. Then when I say activate, all of us, I think even outside Horn of Africa, outside Asia, we have social networks. But those networks, we only activate them when we need them. If we don't need them, if we have efficient, reliable, trustworthy formal institutions, such as banks and customs, we don't need those informal institutions. But when we don't have them, then we need an alternative. And that alternative is just to activate our informal institutions. So when I'm saying informal institutions in the Horn of Africa, we shouldn't understand that it's only in the Horn of Africa, or maybe it's only in Bangladesh or in Asia that has informal institutions. Across the world, such institutions are there, but they are not activated because, other formal institutions might be more efficient or more embedded. And then because of that, the trust becomes very much embedded in everyday activity, whether it's like personal relations, whether it is like economic relations, whether it's like cross-border movement of people or cross-border movement of activities. And that's why I'm saying, to conclude, Borderlands have not realized their economic potential due to low trust between states and would have collapsed if not for the trust between the community. Because it's this trust, that informal trust, that makes the Borderlands in the Horn of Africa function. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed, and looking forward to people's reactions on that fascinating thesis. You really brought out, I think, the tension of the instability narrative, and I think it's good to kind of problematize that narrative also, versus the kind of how crucial to the central state and the sub-regional entities these areas are, particularly to do with revenue. So looking forward to discussion following your presentation also. Let's hear lastly then from Dan. Dan, over to you.
Hi, so I'm Daniel Tucker. I'm from Conciliation Resources. My presentation is going to focus not so much on the conflict dynamics that exist in Borderlands, but instead on the barriers and opportunities that exist within Borderlands for peace building, for building social cohesion, and building trust in Borderlands. Unlike the previous presentations, which are focused on a case studies or on particular areas, this draws more on the collective research and practice from Conciliation Resources and other organizations as a whole. Next slide, please. So I think the main challenge and the major issue that we face is that what we can understand as borderland blindness. And that's to say that border regions are overlooked or looked at negatively, which can lead to the inappropriate design of response strategies that fail to address the core issues and can actually escalate mistrust. At the heart of this is what both Tasnia and Ahmed have touched on, is the center-periphery dynamics that exist in many borderlands and the subsequent systematic social, political, economic exclusion of borderland communities. This means that the analysis, design, and implementation of governance and cohesion initiatives tend to be from the center and lack the knowledge and input from the borderlands themselves. And that isn't just coming from state institutions, but it's also coming from the design of projects by donor institutions as well, are often based on analysis coming from the center rather than from the borderlands. Another thing linked to that is that the peace building and development sector, and I mean that in the broadest sense, both in terms of government, non-government, and also the international community, tends to be conceived within a very rigid nation-state framework. Institutions and agencies are split into country units or desks, and their mandate and financing modalities tend to be defined along these very strict political borders, even though we know, as has been touched upon, that the violence and insecurity and instability often goes across those borders. This hampers the ability to address the transnational nature of violence. And even where there are regional units and structures in place, they tend to also be very strictly geographically defined, which creates issues around engaging on borderlands between those different geographic regions. For example, in West Africa, we're seeing increasingly an issue whereby a lot of institutions are divided along themselves into Sahel units and then coastal West Africa units. But one of the most emerging security and pressing issues at the moment is the flow of instability and insecurity between the Sahel and coastal West Africa. But because of the structure of all the institutions, there aren't really the mechanisms in place to effectively work on both sides. Another key feature is that where we see is that there's a negative narrative around borderlands. They're often referred to in terms of posing an inherent threat, that they are different and inherently deviant from other parts of the nation. This leads to a default focus upon stabilization, securitization, and regulation. Indeed, when there is transnational or regional collaboration, it's often in terms of joint military action. So you have the G5 in the Sahel, you have the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin, and you have this military cooperation. But then at the same time, there's not a cooperation at anything outside of that. So there's competing in the Lake Chad Basin. Each country is doing different and often competing and contrasting approaches to reconciliation that is then creating a lot of issues. But this focus on security and stability can reinforce exclusion, create resentments, and trigger more mistrust in the borderlands. There's also sometimes a political willingness to overlook some of the sacrifice the needs of the borderlands for the achievement of wider national objectives and goals. It feeds into the center periphery dynamics we've already talked about, but it goes even further, whereby not only are the center prioritized, actually action or inaction can take place in borderlands that will knowingly worsen the situation if it improves the prospects for wider national progress. So you can see national agendas around negotiation and reconciliation, yet the borderlands are still in a process of securitization. And then finally, the issue is that borderlands only really become prioritized when something goes wrong and it's impossible to ignore any further. So that leads to reactive rather than preventative response mechanisms, and therefore only addressing the symptoms rather than the underlying causes. Next slide, please. One of the key issues is that we've heard from Ahmed about how there's a hybrid governance in a lot of borderlands, whereby customary non-state structures are often used to fill the vacuum of the state in borderland regions. But what we've seen is that sometimes there's an effort to overly lean on these and formalize these structures. And when you do that, it risks elite capture. It can risk fragmenting leadership in the border regions and can also risk increasing competition. This not only erodes the local capacity to build trust and social cohesion, but can actually in turn escalate tensions. And we've seen time and time again that quite organic and customary mechanisms that were once a great resource for peace building are now actually a barrier to building peace in the region. Part of this is linked to often there's what can be a homogenization of the borderlands, whereby we fail to actually adequately understand and conceptualize the power dynamics within borderlands. And so you can see situations where failure to understand the tensions and mistrust and divisions that already exist within borderlands, and also that there's other types of center periphery dynamics within borderlands. So, for example, borderlands have urban areas and also have rural areas. Where I work in northeast Nigeria, Maiduguri is officially in the periphery if you compare it with Abuja or Lagos, but it is also a city of 1 million people. And the experiences in Maiduguri itself are very different from the experiences in the rural borders of the state. And then the final major challenge that we face is the severe logistical challenges of working in borderlands. Firstly, like the insecurity and limited infrastructure impede access to the region. There's also travel restrictions, which impede the ability to bring people together. These pictures are pictures that I've taken. The bottom one is from the Liberian-Ivorian border. This border was officially closed, but you can see that local people are able to cross it. And we were doing a cross-border dialogue, but bringing together Ivorian and Liberian security forces. And I'd done one on the Liberian side, but it took me a week to be able to go 300 meters to the other side of the border to be able to do the same dialogue on the other side of the border because we just weren't able to cross it. I'll skip to the next slide for the sake of time. In terms of opportunities, one thing is just that we need to adopt a gendered borderland lens, and ensuring that basically the analysis is grounded in the insights and knowledge of people from the borderlands themselves. And then not only is it grounded in the knowledge of people from the region, but it's grounded in the experiences and insights of diverse social groups within the region. And we understand how those experiences vary between different identity groups. Another key thing is that is the importance in Borderlands of navigating quite a complex systems of governance and the significant constraints and the difficulties of identifying entry points. That local peacebuilding actors are very well placed to be able to do that. And by local, I mean actual peacebuilding actors based in the Borderlands, not actors who happen to be based in the state capitals. You really need to be working directly with peacebuilding actors who are in the region, and we need to be able to support them with financial support, logistical support, and technical support to be able to navigate the very complex environment in a safe and effective manner. We also need to push around reimagining the state-centric configuration of the peacebuilding sector so that we instead begin to focus on a conflict system, regardless of whether it takes one across a national boundary. This might mean establishing more regional teams with a mandate to work across borders, but also having funding mechanisms that span borders as well. Something else that I think is an entry point is that we need to tap into unexpected or traditionally neglected potential peace actors who are maybe uniquely placed to be able to navigate and exchange on both sides of the border. There's a tendency to rely on quite traditional peacebuilding actors, but we've seen success in engaging with, for example, commercial bike riders who ply the border regions, lorry drivers, market traders, and we've done a lot of work with transhuman pastoralists who are crossing both sides of the border. And these are people who are naturally able to navigate the borders very effectively, and we should look at engaging with them more and more. Next slide, please. At the heart of building empathy, understanding, and confidence in border regions is connecting people. And this needs to happen at many levels. First, you need to connect the periphery and the center and amplify the voice of those in the periphery. And something that is very important for us from Conciliation Resources is that this tends to focus on maybe amplifying and connecting civilian actors with the state in the center. But what we've really seen is there's also the need to connect the local government and security officials with the center as well, because they have their own challenges and grievances with the center. And so we need to connect on that level. We also need to foster more transnational and regional state-to-state collaboration, but in particular to support those initiatives to broaden their focus away from that very narrow focus on security, and bring in a more holistic approach that also values conflict prevention, social cohesion, and trust building. But the other thing is that both of those approaches focus on the state, but we also need to look at building, connecting people and building networks below the state. And that means encouraging cross-border engagement at the local and subnational level, but also encouraging cross-border engagement between non-state institutions and sectors. So we've seen it between the need to connect, for example, media on both sides of borders, academia, civil society, and business, and all of these things, rather than solely relying on state-to-state engagement. And finally, I would just like to talk about how rather than viewing Borderlands as inherently marginal, we need to understand and leverage the unique opportunities that Borderlands present and the entry points that they might provide for building confidence and social cohesion. We need to leverage, for example, the cross-border kinship affiliations that can serve as an opportunity to build relationships. There's been a lot of work around trade and cross-border markets. So the pictures here are around the trade was used as a source of confidence building across the line of control in Jammu, Kashmir. And then the top picture is a picture of a market, a cattle market along the Cameroonian-Nigeria border. And this is a place where we've done a lot of dialogues and spaces around in markets and around trade as an opportunity to build confidence, but also around joint resource management and disaster preparedness and management. So we used the Ebola epidemic as an opportunity to improve collaboration and coordination and trust building between the Liberian authorities and the Ivorian authorities. And all of those little opportunities maybe offer an entry point to build confidence and connection on issues that are of mutual benefit rather than on the issues of contestation first. And these are really important first stepping stones to building confidence in one another. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I think you've covered an awful lot of ground there and opened up an awful lot of great topics. And I think this last one about leveraging the unique opportunities really speaks well to the whole series of presentations we've just heard from. So thank you so much. So now we're at the chance where people can offer their reactions, ask questions, share their experiences. I think we would love to hear from you about your reactions, what you've just heard about, but also your own experiences. So who would like to start us off? Either in the chat or you can put your hand up. And here you can use the QR code to access the XCEPT research website, and we'll also post a few different research reports in the chat. Helen Smith, thank you. Over to you.
Yes, thank you all so much. This is so enlightening and wonderful, and such an important topic to be talking about. My curiosity is around just how you find communities' reception to those outside of them, trying to be helpful or assuming they are helpful when they may not be. But whether you found that this work tends to be more fruitful and maybe more accepted by those at the borders, by those who have grown up there and really know the culture, or whether there have been instances where once trust has been built and relationships are authentic and transformational, community members find that it's helpful to have someone from outside the situation really there to help mediate and make a difference.
That's a great question about relationships and trust. Maybe we can add another question and then hear from the panel. Also welcome to share in the chat. We have 30 minutes now for our discussion. Okay, let's get some reactions from our panelists on these relationships. Tasnia, I'm going to ask you first.
So particularly to Bangladesh and India, Borderlands, what we've seen is people are receptive to quote unquote outsiders coming in and sort of engaging with them. I remember in one of the study sites, each of the households that I was going to select them, I was invited to lunch. Again, it comes with the perception of, oh, you know, my clothes give away that I'm from a city and they want to hear my side of their journey as well. Like, why am I here? Who do they know? Like, where's my grandfather's house? There's that curiosity there. And it's, you know, it's sort of embedded in the culture of Bangladesh. But in terms of support systems, I think they tend to rely more on community leaders who know what the issues are and who have had a track record of trying to solve them after listening to the entire community, who are more approachable. So, for example, when I've asked how many times you've seen the person that you voted for in your local union, and they said only the time that they came to them to ask for votes. And the second time was after a climate disruption, where everyone was waiting for, everyone was told that he's visiting this elected official. So everyone stood in line in a heat wave to wait for him. And his car came, he waved, and he went away. And so there is that sort of mistrust and real, resentment towards people with power in these areas. So to be an alternative to those systems, people are welcoming outsiders like NGO professionals and researchers to be able to speak to them. But also there's that fatigue of constantly being a research respondent or an aid beneficiary and then nothing really changing in their lives. So it's a mix of both, I'd say.
Thank you, Tasnia. Well, let's hear from Daniel, and then there's a question for Ahmed in the chat.
It was the part that I skipped over a little bit, was that I think the reality is in a lot of the places we work, there isn't one person who is a effective mediator or is particularly well trusted by everybody, and by all sides and by all of the different groups. And this is where it's a very complex web of power dynamics and of trust and things like this. And so what we've seen is that often you need to have multiple different mediators and multiple different people who are able to engage with different constituencies in a different way. And so for example, like in the work that we do in Burkina Faso, along the Burkina Faso-Ivorian border, we particularly need an additional person who is able to engage with pastoralist communities and with the Fulani community, because of the high level of mistrust and suspicion of people who are from outside of their ethnic group, because of the very negative stereotypes and narratives that have been created, that there's just a very high level of suspicion. But you need basically somebody who can vouch for you and connect you. And so I would view it more as having a web of different people who are able to connect you, but also being aware that if you are relying on, because I think one of the key things for building this trust is like the consistency, as Tasnia mentioned, is like being able to be seen, not being viewed as being extractive and maybe coming once and then never coming back, but this consistency of engagement. But one of the challenges of being and relying on local actors is that you've got to be aware that they also have their own biases, and those biases can be replicated in the work that they're doing and those engagements. And that isn't, I'm not going to say that's necessarily a problem, but the issue is when that problem isn't acknowledged, and you've got to be aware of where those biases and those discriminations are then maybe inhibiting and preventing other people from being able to participate.
Thanks, Dan. And maybe just to add on that also from our experience at RVI, I think it's about, all of these things is about long-term, and you said this also, long-term relationship building. So yes, you need a variety of people with different backgrounds and skill sets, but it's also that long-term engagement so that you keep coming back, you build that trust, there is that investment. And I think, I have this phrase about like the Twitter peace process. We had one of those actually in Ethiopia almost. You had a very short time frame in which a very big structural issue was digested into a couple of tweets. And there are reasons why this is coming undone now. I'm talking about the COHA, the comprehensive agreement that ended the war in Tigray in the north of Ethiopia. And these are very short-term responses to very long-term structural issues. And so that's now why you have these gaps appearing in the way that that's implemented. So really kind of, both from a organizational perspective, also from a donor perspective, what are the funding horizons of the donors with which we work, and what are the planning timelines for kind of the programs which we're trying to design and implement. But let's hear from Ahmed, and then Dan, there's another question for you in the chat.
And thanks. So the question for me in the chat is about the huge potential of Borderlands and the communities which is not activated. how do you think we can center them better in the conflict response? So basically, as I said, and as Daniel has also emphasized it, the borderland areas are really underestimated and undervalued, because the borderland areas have both economic potential, social potential, but also they have the potential to become to facilitate peace building and conflict resolution in the borderland area, simply because the borderland people understand both sides of the border, and they can become a bridge. They enjoy a high level of trust, maybe on both sides of the border. They quite most often they understand the language, the culture, the interest, the dynamics and the concerns and the grievances of the borderland communities. So if they have been, if that has been acknowledged and harnessed, then definitely I think the borderland areas have a very huge potential to build peace and to build bridges between countries and states. So that's one thing. And but of course, there must be some reasons why the borderland potential is not harnessed because sometimes that doesn't serve or advance the interest of the elite at the center. And always the borderland areas are like a basis of problems that has to be contained. For example, like in the Somalia, Ethiopia borderlands, always historically, Kenya and Ethiopia have been trying to contain the borderland areas, maybe to contain the political Islam that's crossing the border, but maybe also to contain nationalism that was crossing the border. So that's one thing. Then maybe briefly to the first question about the relations. I can draw an example from RFI and recent study on transborder mobile money. So there are many financial institutions that are providing mobile money and mobile money applications, but not all of them are embedded or connected or are used in the borderlands, simply because the financial institutions that are owned by investors who are from the center, they always strictly implement the regulations and the demands of the center. They don't compromise, whether it's like you have to have an ID, whether it's like you have to have this and that. So because of that, the borderland people, they don't like to use the banks and the financial institutions that are owned by people from the center, but instead they like to use financial institutions that are owned by people from the borderlands, because those financial institutions can understand them, can accommodate their needs, including absence of IDs, or maybe most of the time not having IDs. And the question of the outsiders, I think always outsiders are perceived to be, they become part of the problem in the borderland areas. And the reason why I say that, the outsiders, when they are coming to the borderlands, their first entry point is the center. So the center will try to influence their perception towards the borderland areas. So already they come with a whole attitude of outsiders come with an attitude of that reflects from the attitude of the people at the center. And at the same time, they just want to advance what the narrative is, whether political narrative or economic narrative is of the center, including maybe say coming to the borderlands and saying, okay, we need more formalization, and just trying to problematize informalization and see informality as a source of weakness, without accommodating that the informality and how the local people perceive.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. Dan, a question about local peace builders and how to empower them given their vulnerabilities.
Yeah, so I think, again, I think that's one of the, I was going to touch on it and then there wasn't enough time. I think one of the challenges of working in Borderlands, and one of the real problems that I see, is that because of the level of risk, I see that a lot of international organizations sometimes confer and transfer that risk onto local peace builders because they're unable to travel, and the challenges that they face to operate, they pass them on to local peace builders. To combat that is that I think first and foremost, any partnerships and working with local peace builders shouldn't be a financial relationship first and foremost. It should be about working in a collaborative two-way relationship where the program itself is based on the design and the input of those local actors. It's not a project whereby you sign a contract with them and then they're expected to deliver, and it's a service delivery contract rather than actually a collaborative thing. So you need to work with local partners so that they have the genuine confidence in the ability to push back on maybe the program, and they have that confidence in their relationship with you as an external actor to be able to say, no, we're not able to do this. In terms of other things, is that I think there's also a case of resource. Like you need to invest in these things. So like Conciliation Resources in the past has done things around investing in security assessments of partner offices and about how they can increase the security of their staff and their traveller practices, helping them to go on safety and security courses, all of these things. But there's also other things you can do outside of just working directly with the partners. It's also external actors can play a significant role in maybe negotiating and getting agreements with local government around the role and the conditions that local peacebuilding actors are working in, so that maybe they're not perceived as working against the government and actually like serving as this bridge between local peacebuilding actors and the government. But also I think that a lot of the risks really come from the donor expectations. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do in the international peacebuilding community to maybe push back on these, so push for greater flexibility. Because I think sometimes like a lot of the risk comes when partners feel like there is a pressure to get a project delivered, that they have to do this activity by the end of the month, and that there isn't the freedom and the adaptability and the flexibility to be able to push back and rearrange things if security warrants it and things like this. So I think we really need to push back with donors and around flexibility, and also really emphasize that sometimes if an activity can't be delivered because of security, then we just got to accept that. We never let an activity get implemented if it's not being done in a way that minimizes security as much as possible. And we've got to convey that and manage the expectations of donors so they're not then being pushed on to us and then being subsequently pushed on to local actors.
Thanks, Dan. And I think the organizational red lines are super important, and thanks for raising that. That's great. Ilgin, thank you for coming into the discussion. Over to you.
My internet seems to be a bit unstable. So thank you for the insightful presentations, first of all. My question is, when working with diverse local partners and actors in fragile and conflict-affected contexts, how do you balance impartiality, especially, for instance, when a conflict rises, while also showing solidarity with communities you engage with and build trust and long-term relationships? Thank you already.
Thank you so much. Tasnia, let's hear from you first.
Particular to Bangladesh and India and climate-affected borderlands, conflict isn't, I wouldn't describe it as, an active state of violence where one party is battling the other. Where there is an aspect of choosing sides is mostly to do with political parties, and what we've seen very recently with the Bangladeshi protests against the former government, that relationship and that, sort of severing of relationship has affected local borderlands in a very unique way. Minority households that I'd spoken to who didn't want to move away from Bangladesh shared that they now want to, because they feel that they're, easy targets anytime a conflict erupts. Or people who had sided with the ruling party and have been on their side for multiple years previously, now are under attack. So much so that elected officials have been lynched and seriously hurt or are in hiding. So making these choices between power, people who hold power, you often have to choose these sides. But at the end of the day, it's the community members who are the poorest and who are the most vulnerable that continue to be so in my experience. And so those choices tend to reflect almost an enforced decision that they have to make, and now they're reeling back from it. But absolutely not comparable to situations where there are, active wars happening and you're choosing one side or the other. But this is more, subtle, but obviously has a lot of impact.
Yeah, that's a really important one, tricky one. Daniel, did you want to add on this?
I think it kind of touches on what I mentioned before, but I think fundamentally it's a trade-off, and that sometimes you've got to have these quite difficult decisions where, again, like touching back on using and working with local peacebuilding actors, is they offer a lot of benefits, but then there are also challenges, and it's this constant trade-off. And like fundamentally, it's my belief that there is very few people in any conflict situation would be viewed as being impartial by everybody in a process, and that actually what is very important, as I said before, is that you have this. You're not just relying on one person, but also you have a whole network of people. But it's that you acknowledge and you understand why somebody might be viewed as being biased or discriminated against, and don't necessarily get defensive of that and hide it. So it's about acknowledging where those issues exist. And like, I'll give an example of for a long time, there's been this expectation in West Africa and Africa more generally around the use of traditional leaders as this legitimate and trusted and impartial actors. But increasingly, you now see that their leadership is very divisive, that it's very contested, and that one person might be accepted as an impartial and legitimate mediator by one group, but by another group it's not. And so I think it's very difficult to be able to say that we're going to find one person or a group of people who are viewed as impartial by everyone. But as long as you're able to build confidence in the process, and build confidence that each side is represented in that mediation process in some way, then I think that's the best way forward.
Thanks, Dan, for giving that one a go. Tasnia, I wanted to come back to... Oh, Ilgin, do you want to follow up? Or is that a legacy hand?
I have a second question, but I would like to first give the word to maybe other questions, and then I can ask.
All right, thank you. I wanted to follow up with Tasnia about this kind of cost of resilience question and the kind of the limits of resilience and their impact on social cohesion. I think there's a lot of resilience research. There's a lot of reason why there would be resilience research, but we kind of miss the part about what it costs to be continuously resilient and increasingly resilient. So yeah, I'd love to hear from you, Tasnia, on that.
Of course, and I think given that the climate crisis is worsening, this notion of what a resilient household or a resilient person looks like has been brought into discussion quite a bit, and it is almost shaped with how a particular NGO defines resilience and what the indicators a household needs to meet to become a resilient household. But in reality, it doesn't always work like that. Essentially, if you go to an area affected by climate change, with extreme heat or salinity intrusion, slow and sudden, events of climate change. A lot of NGO officials would say that the household is resilient if it's, on a more solid ground than the neighbor. But it doesn't mean that the household has access to basic needs. It doesn't mean that their children are going to proper schools. It doesn't mean that, a hospital is nearby. Almost in some of our study sites, it takes over 2 hours for a person to reach emergency healthcare. So again, by these negotiations that climate actors have both among themselves and with the state, I feel like we need to deconstruct what resilience really means in these areas, obviously with the perception of this being a borderland. And in how resilience is distributed, like I said, we see a lot of outsourcing of state responsibility, which is really, really, I think, at many times at the core of the problem and at the core of how center-periphery relationships shape this particular borderland. Bangladesh historically has seen India as an ally, and so is India. But that center dynamic does not translate to border violence. It does not translate to, a climate-affected borderland becoming more resilient to climate impact. So it's tricky. I'm all for reconstructing that definition of what resilience means, unless the particular household feels that they're safe from future disruptions, both climate and their negotiations with the border.
That's a really helpful way of looking at it. Thank you, Tasnia. Let's hear back from Ilgin. Ilgin, over to you. You're on mute. Thanks.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Right. So I'm working in an NGO that is working in international programs with local organizations and actors, but we are also having a peace educational academy. My second question comes to the peace education in the sense, and I would like to ask regarding some of the main challenges to building social cohesion and resilience in border regions that comes to your mind. So I would like to ask for your opinions and suggestions on how peace educational programs can prepare peace builders to address these challenges before coming to work in these regions.
Thanks, Ilgin. Maybe it'll be great just to frame the responses and give our panelists a chance to think about it more. Maybe you could share any of the challenges you have faced in your organization with supporting peace education. Is there anything that comes to mind? Any particular challenges that you've faced when you're thinking through peace education in your organization? You're on mute. You went off mute and went back on mute. Let's have Daniel and Tasnia think about that, and then I wanted to throw a question back at Ahmed from something that he raised in his presentation, and we have 5 minutes. Okay, no problem. Maybe you could put it in the chat, but we'll hear from Daniel and Tasnia on that. A question back to Ahmed, really, about social cohesion, trust, but also obviously you've heard a lot from us about Borderlands, and I think one of the particular aspects that we find interesting in this project is the relationship between the Borderlands and the state. And actually one of the characteristics is about the absence of the state in these areas. But maybe, Ahmed, you could tell us a bit more about what that means in your understanding.
And thanks a lot, Hannah. So whenever I participate, some discussion is about the informality of anything, whether it's informal trade, informal community, humanitarianism, informal community cohesion, or informal trust. One question that always comes up is where is the state? Let us bring the state back in our analysis, because at the end of the day, we have to also understand where the state fits in this analysis. So basically, in the cross-border areas, we have to understand three things so that we can be able to understand the role of the state or where the state is. Number one, we have to understand and conceptualize the cross-border areas and the borderlands as economic spaces. A lot of economic activities, cross-border transactions, cross-border trade activities in different forms, whether it's like livestock, maybe commodities, maybe electronics, takes place in the borderland areas. That's number one. So we have to conceptualize and understand borderland areas as economic spaces. That's number one. Number two, then also we have to understand that within those spaces, we have different actors, both non-state and state actors, right? So, and then those different actors also try to compete, sometimes collaborate, sometimes contest for the follow on who's going to control that economic space. So that's the reason. I mean, one of the reasons why the borderland areas become areas of contestation is because they are areas of economic spaces. So, for example, we know that if you read, those of you who are familiar with the state building theories, states are built around economic corridors, because a state cannot function and cannot exist without a revenue, and the borderland areas become a source of that revenue, right? However, sometimes those actors, non-state actors, even sometimes the local communities who are not happy with the state institutions, or maybe who challenge the state institutions, or maybe who question the legitimacy of the state institutions, they also try to contest the state by not giving the revenues, while the state will try to also take some revenues. And then we will have a whole battle and tension around access to revenues, control of revenues, facilitation of trade, not facilitating trade, and so on and so forth. And borderland areas, I mean, when you talk about borderland areas, we can talk about long borders. But when we're talking about borderland areas, we are talking about specific areas. We are not talking about the 1,000-kilometer border line between the two states, but we are maybe talking about specific urban areas, or maybe specific crossing points, or maybe specific economic spaces. And the question is, why are we talking about those specific areas and not the 1,000-kilometer border long? It's simply because it's that specific area where the state and the non-state actors will try to contest, will try to control the flow of trade. And because of that, there was a book that was recently published on trade makes the state in the Somali borderland, in the Somali territories. So basically, different state actors, non-state actors will try to control trade, facilitate trade, and extract revenues from trade. So it's only those actors, whether state or non-state, that successfully facilitate trade, that successfully build relationships with the local communities, that can emerge as the powerful actor. So sometimes even non-state actors can successfully outsmart the state actors, because simply they can build relationships and they can understand the community needs, including maybe low taxation or maybe more flexible revenue collection. So that's why the states and non-state actors are more visible in the borderland areas. I mean, when I say borderland areas, I don't know how Tasnia and Daniel can conceptualize, but the way I conceptualize, we're talking about specific urban areas, or maybe marketplaces, or maybe custom points, but we are not referring to the long borderline between two countries.
That's great. I think thank you, Ahmed. We have these two intersecting themes of borderlands, but also social cohesion and trust. We have a bit of a chat going on on the sideline. Thanks, Tasnia, for your additions there. Sorry, something's doing something. No, that's fine. Dan, did you want to add here? I think we're coming to time, really. So I'll just give the final opportunity to our panelists for a final word, if they have anything to add at this point.
I was writing something for the chat about the peace education, but I agree with what's being said in the chat. But I think the other thing is that I think sometimes when we talk about peace education, sometimes it can be overly or exclusively focused, and like the target is the most marginalized, the most excluded, and the most vulnerable. And there's also the risk that we also need to make sure that we are targeting peace education to the existing power holders as well. And so the peace education also needs to be targeted at the security agents, the traditional leaders, and the government officials who maybe serve as a block, a spoiler, as a barrier. And one of the big challenges you can have is that if you create this big mass of a community who has this agenda for peace and want change, but there's no space for that to go anywhere and there's no progress in it, that can actually escalate tensions even more. So if you're going to be doing peace education, you also need to make sure that the existing power holders are being brought along in that process and they're also on board with it as well. Otherwise you can accidentally create more problems down the line.
That's a really important point, and I talked at the beginning also about unintended consequences, and those are things that we have to kind of think about and plan for. I think thanks for sticking with us. We're a few minutes over time. I hope that you found the session interesting, insightful from different kind of global perspectives, different organizational perspectives. I don't know if there's a way to follow up via this conference, but if there is, please do get in touch if you'd like to. And thanks so much, everybody. Great to be with you for this last hour and a quarter. Bye for now.